Obviously, the impeachment discussion has taken up so much oxygen in Washington, D.C., naturally with Congress not here. Not much time to do anything else anyway, but everyone's being asked about it. Presidential candidates are being asked about it. What do you think? Latest developments in the story being watched closely. It has taken a lot of ink. It is taking a lot of airtime, and we're going to spend a little time talking about it in political, maybe get a little bit of historical perspective on it. Dr. William Rosenberg, professor of political science at Drexel University, is joining us. He is tweeting at Dr. B or DRB Rosenberg. Bill, welcome back. Thanks for being here today.
Good morning.
Thanks for giving me all the homework, by the way, reading your notes. By the way, I wanted to go. The first thing that strikes me is right there on the first page of what you were looking at, and this is interesting to note, is that at this same point in the presidency of Barack Obama, he and Donald Trump had statistically the same approval rating. President Obama was at 40%. Donald Trump is at 39% right now. That's an interesting thing to keep in mind.
Kind of incredible when you think about it, but when we take a look in sort of a broader perspective, polarization over the past decade or so has been very intense, and I think that's just another sign of how polarized we are between either Democrats or Republicans, if you want to think it that way, or liberals and conservatives. We have two very entrenched camps, and neither side is really moving much.
What's also interesting is that for people who've been following this, you know that impeachment is a political process. It's not a legal process, which is why the rules of evidence do not apply. The House has to determine whether or not to move forward with impeachment. If they do indeed impeach the president, it goes to the Senate for a vote. And the likely or the expectation is that the Senate would not vote to remove President Trump from office because it's majority Republicans. What I think is a really interesting perspective that you bring is that, you know, the likelihood that Republicans will turn on the president is pretty small. But if they do, it would happen suddenly. Why do you say that?
Well, I think if you take a look at sort of the trajectory of events over time, that we eventually get to something which we might consider a tipping point. Before that tipping point occurs, we don't necessarily think that something's going to change, but all of a sudden something happens, and then people's view changes. And if we think about it not just in terms of an American perspective, but an international perspective, for example, the Arab Spring, basically got touched off by a young man who basically set himself on fire because he was so concerned about the corrupt practices that were taking place in Tunisia. Then a little later, we had the same thing going on in Cairo with those massive protests that ended up bringing down the leader of Egypt. So when we take a look at Donald Trump's current administration, there's nothing surprising that there's about a lot of tension between different forces in the United States that either support him or don't. But your point is well taken, that the House is very likely to be able to have enough votes to impeach the president, but to remove him from office is going to revolve around two-thirds of all senators agreeing to take him out. Not a majority, but two-thirds. And right now, the Democrats don't even have a majority in the Senate, so they're going to have to convince other people to come along. And I think, you know, if we use history again as an example, if we go back to the Nixon period, Nixon, you know, won a major election in 1968. He won again in 1972, but he ended up having a downfall when the Republican leadership ended up saying, you know, we don't have confidence in you. The American public doesn't have confidence. And 3 United States senators went to the president. One of them was Hugh Scott from Pennsylvania. Another one was Barry Goldwater, and basically said, you know, the jig is up. You're going to have to step aside because we're not going to be able to support you anymore. So that classic meeting in 1974 really was the end for Richard Nixon.
The one of the arguments being used, and again, Professor William Rosenberg, Dr. William Rosenberg, Professor of Political Science at Drexel University with us on POTUS, one of the arguments that has been coming from the president, from the White House, from the surrogates is that, yeah, what about Joe Biden? In other words, you're not paying enough attention to the corruption of Joe Biden. As I mentioned, this is a political, not a law process, so it's not about presenting evidence. But how does that argument work? Does it?
Well, I think it depends on who you are. If you're a regular listener to Fox News and you're a supporter of President Trump, you're going to be looking for information that's going to support that position, that really this isn't a failing of Trump. It's really all about Joe Biden. One of the things, though, that I find really remarkable is a couple of years ago I was looking at the net worth of various national figures, and Joe Biden had been kind of consistently not a really wealthy man. He had served his whole life in public service, and if you take a look at the net wealth of all the candidates running, let's say, in the 2020 election, while there are some that have less net worth than Joe Biden, he's still on the lower end. So if corruption was really Joe Biden's bag, you'd think he'd have more money. The other thing is that with all this examination of this Biden, Hunter Biden and Joe Biden situation in Ukraine, you have to sort of pause and think back to when Donald Trump took office. He brought his daughter into the White House. He brought his son-in-law, and they were in the room, and at the same time they were dealing with national government business, they were also doing their own personal business with things like patents in China. So, both sides basically do this. Well, what about this and what about that? At the end of the day, Joe Biden has, by all accounts, with all independent fact checkers, not done anything wrong. And holding yourself up to that degree of scrutiny and still not finding anything is probably a pretty good sign for Joe Biden that he has been conducting himself in an appropriate manner.
Bill, I want to ask you about your students, because when we started these conversations, it was in the midst of the 2008 campaign. Obviously, there was a sense of something was going to happen. We had two candidates, one a woman, one an African-American, who were vying for the presidential nomination for the Democratic Party. Of course, eventually Barack Obama became president, and a lot of students were, in some ways, maybe getting involved for the first time. It was really an appealing contest to the youth. I mean, is the sense of politics the same? Is it a more entrenched version rather than a vision of what needs to happen? It's a determination to take down somebody that they don't like. I mean, give us a sense of how this kind of a story arc plays out when you're teaching the subjects you teach.
Well, I think one of the things that I found really fascinating, and I'm glad you brought this up, when we first started talking around 2008, there was such excitement about young people, particularly about the campaign of Barack Obama. And I noticed on people's laptop computers and on their shirts and their backpacks, there were political buttons or stickers, all with Obama labels on them. You couldn't help but notice that there was a lot of support among young people. And what I found as time went on, that degree of interest, at least in terms of outward expressions of support, dramatically decreased. I make a point of looking at my students out in my class and looking at their laptops, and now I see in a class of 20 students maybe one or two that have anything overtly political, and it's not often even about a particular person, it's about a cause. And I think what we saw in 2014, again going back a little bit, is that there had been a remarkable drop-off in terms of young people participating in politics and voting, and also a decrease in terms of African-American support. In 2016, I think there was a little bit of the sitting on the hands routine, with some people just not fully embracing Hillary Clinton, and as a result, Donald Trump was able to squeak out a narrow electoral college victory, even though he did lose in terms of the popular vote. Presently, I think the affect that I get from a lot of my students, and again, it's an anecdotal response to you, is people are much more aware of politics, and they're aware of Donald Trump and the Democrats' perspectives. But at the same time, there's not necessarily as clear and energized mobilization of young people to necessarily go out and vote and to press these issues. I think a lot of what's going on right now, not just among young people, but society in general, I think, is kind of an uneasiness. A lot of people have friends that are on the other side of the aisle. Democrats have Republican friends and Republicans have Democratic friends. But again, anecdotally, hear many people saying, I don't even really want to ask my friend X about this because I don't really want to know the answer. So political dialogue in terms of communications between friends and even family members, I think, has suffered because of this extreme polarization that's been taking place in the United States.
Well, it is anecdotal, but I think it's probably not the first time we've heard stories like that, and we'll probably hear more, and we'll have to track that as we move forward. Looking for a hero, I guess everyone is. Dr. William Rosenberg. Bill, thanks as always.
All right. Have a great day. Take care.
Dr. William Rosenberg, professor of political science at Drexel University, is also, by the way, the co-author of books like News Verdicts, The Debates in Presidential Campaigns, and The Politics of Disenchantment. He is tweeting at DR, as in doctor, at DRB Rosenberg, Rosenberg.